Okay, hi everyone. This is Daniel Karapkin speaking to you from Thornhill, Ontario, for webyeshiva.org. We are studying Moreh Nevukhim, Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed. I hope everyone is well, and we are ready to begin Section 3, Chapter 5. My goal is, hopefully today, we'll be able to cover, as we did last week, two short chapters, Chapters 5 and Chapter 6. In order to enable us to do that, I'm going to share with you my screen that has an outline of it, of what we're studying. Just give us one moment, please. Okay, here we are. So the title of chapter 5, what we would like to call it, is Three Visions Within Maaseh Merkavah. I know that the Rambam, in discussing Aristotelian philosophy, which he said was really the goal in his introduction, explained that really the goal of Moreh Nevukhim, or one of the primary goals, is to try and unpack and explain for us two areas of esoteric knowledge that are contained both within the Torah and within Greek philosophy, and the Rambam felt that they are one and the same. Maaseh Bereshit and Maaseh Merkavah, the act of creation and the act of the chariot, which is what we've been studying the last few chapters since the beginning of section 3, the act of the chariot, Ezekiel's vision of the chariot. The lineup, as far as how they align with Aristotelian philosophy, is Maaseh Bereshit is physics, and Maaseh Merkavah is metaphysics, a study of the cosmos. However, it's not that pat. In other words, there is an integration between physics and metaphysics. There's a place where heaven meets earth, because we understand that, according to Aristotelian science, that there is a heavenly influence on what occurs in this world, and the cosmos, the celestial bodies, influence invariably the terrestrial realm, to the point where all of matter that has form, including all inorganic material, organic material, living organisms, all of us, everything that exists in this terrestrial orbit is influenced and somehow formed by the celestial bodies. And the question really is, where does Maaseh Bereshit end and Maaseh Merkavah begin? And that's really, it's a little bit vague, because within the vision of the chariot, we have this vision of the Ofanim, which are the wheels, which, according to the Rambam that we learned in previous chapters, is really a reference to both primordial matter and the four layers of the four elements that exist in our world and combine in order to create all of the things that exist in our terrestrial realm. So you're seeing a bit of physics intertwining with metaphysics within this whole depiction of Ezekiel chapter 1 and then later Ezekiel chapter 10. So it's important to note that. And it's also, I believe, important to note that within Maaseh Merkavah, within this vision of the chariot, the Rambam's going to explain to us that there are three actual sort of breakdowns of different kinds of science, or I guess we would call it science, the way that the commentaries explain what the Rambam is trying to impart to us, that even within Maaseh Merkavah, this vision, there are three realms of discipline or study or philosophy even that are contained within this. And this is what the Rambam is really getting to when he starts off by saying that among the things, and this is on page 425 in the Pines edition, among the things to which your attention ought to be directed is Ezekiel's expression, visions of God. And this is contained in the very first verse of the book of Ezekiel. It says, Va'er'eh marot Elokim. I saw the visions in the plural. And what the Rambam is going to point out to us is that there are multiple visions, actually a total of three visions that the prophet Ezekiel is describing, because these three visions really break down into three different sort of categories of existence that exist within this vision of the celestial realm. So the first vision, there are three times when Ezekiel says the word va'ereh. Va'ereh, I saw, I had a vision. And that occurs three and only three times. It occurs once in Perek Aleph Pasuk Dalid, verse 4, Va'era v'hinei ruach se'ara ba'amin hatzafon. I had a vision, and there was a stormy wind that came from the north. And it had chashmal, it had this sort of kind of very ethereal, electrical, or fiery kind of aura around it. Umitocha, and in verse 5, what is this vision introducing? Dumut arba chayot, the four chayot. Now remember, if you recall, the chayot is for the Rambam a code word for the celestial spheres. The second vision is that of the Ofanim in verse 15. Va'era hachayot v'hinei ofan echad ba'aretz eitzel hachayot la'arbat panav. This is the second time with the word I saw, or I had a vision, which is I saw the chayot, but connected to the chayot was this one ofan representing primordial matter, which afterwards breaks up into ofanim, the four elements. And finally, the third vision that Yechezkel has starts with verse 26, where he talks about what exists above the firmament in his vision, which is above the chayot. And he talks about this kisei, this throne, and on the throne is the image of a man. And then in verse 27, he says, Va'era ke'ein chashmal. I had a vision of something that was like chashmal, this electrical kind of fiery aura, and it's descriptive of what this man looked like. Now, we're not going to spend a lot of time because this is representative of the most esoteric type of vision that Ezekiel has, representing some kind of illustration of the very first emanation from God. As the commentaries point out, the Rambam believes that no depiction of God is possible within a prophetic image, even though he had talked about before how prophets sometimes see a representation of God himself as an old man or as a warrior and so forth. So it could be that this is some kind of representation of God himself, or as some commentaries point out, if you were going to truly use an Aristotelian kind of representation, it's the very first emanation from God, which is sort of like outside the most outermost sphere, is the first emanation of God, and that's represented by a man because it is sort of almost like the closest that we can get to an understanding of the Ribono Shel Olam, the Master of the Universe himself. We're going to learn a little bit more about Chashmal in chapter 7, so I'm going to put that aside for just a moment. But what I want to point out is that even though the Rambam himself does not even tell us what these three visions represent, he just wishes to bring to our attention that there are three visions and only three visions, as the Shem Tov points out, that within this vision of the metaphysical realm of this Ma'aseh Merkavah, there are three different chokhmot, three different areas or disciplines of Aristotelian wisdom, in what he calls chokhmat hatchuna, chokhmat hateva, and chokhmat ha'elokit. Now, in truth, in the medieval world, there was a belief in 7 disciplines of science, which we're not going to go through all of them now. But the Shem Tov uses three of those terminologies in order to describe how the Rambam is breaking down the tripartite, the three-part vision that Yechezkel is having. He has a vision of Chokhmat HaTechuna, a vision of the astronomical realm or the discipline of astronomy, which requires mathematical and geometric knowledge, and that is represented by his vision of the Chayot. He has to have a knowledge of natural science, chokhmat hateva, to understand the workings of physics, the way things work in our realm through the combination of the four elements which create compound organisms and materials that comprise all of that exists in our sublunary terrestrial realm. And that is represented by his vision of the Ophanim. And finally, the most sublime and esoteric kind of vision is Chokhmat Elokit, divine science, the Chashmal and the man. These last three verses of the first chapter of Yechezkel. Now, what I'd like to point out that for these two chapters that we're hopefully going to be studying today, chapters 5 and 6, the Rambam actually utilizes Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral tradition, the Talmudic tradition about the vision of Ezekiel chapter 1, to help us understand the Rambam's interpretation of these visions. So the first thing I wanted to point out is that it's a little bit, it takes a little bit of time to really unpack what is actually taking place in the Gemara, because there seems to be a dispute among the sages as to what exactly the depiction is and what we're allowed to impart to our students. Now, just to remind you, we started off with this, and we've learned this Mishnah a number of times because it really is integral to the whole project of the Moreh Nevukhim to sort of study Maaseh Bereshit and Maaseh Merkavah. We know that the Mishnah in the second chapter of Chagigah limits the access to these two very esoteric disciplines of knowledge. We know that the Mishnah tells us that we're not allowed to teach Maaseh Bereshit Bishnayim with anything more than one student present. You can't even have two people present when you want to teach the act of creation, sort of what the Rambam had called physics. V'lo b'merkavah biachid, and you can't even have one student to teach Maaseh Merkavah. Ela imkein haya chacham umevin midato, unless he is wise and discerning on his own. That means that I can choose one disciple to teach Maaseh Merkavah, provided that he has, the way the Rambam understood it, a proper grounding in Aristotelian science and philosophy. And the Rambam in his Mishnah commentary points out, "V'hu shemit orer umevin ha'inyanim me'atzmo ve'eno tzarich leva'er lo." This means that he has enough internal wisdom already that he doesn't require an extensive amount of explanation. All I have to, ela romzimlo beremez, v'hu lomeid v'dan al piv me'atzmo. All I have to do is mention to him some terse words in a metaphorical way. I can just allude to him in an illusory way, just to allude to him what I'm trying to get at, and he can pick up the rest on his own. V'zeh inyan omram, and that's why our sages say, shonin lo rashei haprakim, that we only give over the major points without going into any extensive detail. Lefi sheyeh sham inyanim hanechkakim benafshot hashlemim mibnei adam. And the reason is, says the Rambam, and he uses a very interesting language. He says that there are very lofty matters that wise people contain within their souls. And sometimes when you try to convert those lofty ideas into extensive verbiage, you actually end up deconstructing or causing a disintegration of those very lofty ideas. And he says, "Ucheshemasbirim otam belashon." When you explain those things using language alone, umimashlim otam bimishalim, or you try to use metaphor to try and convey an idea, pag ta'aman v'yotzin me'inyanam. Sometimes you actually cause a diminution, a sort of a reduction of the quality of the thought by going into extensive detail and trying to explain it. That's what the Rambam is explaining, what the Mishnah means when it says that when you teach Maaseh Merkavah, you must choose a disciple who already has a certain grounding in this knowledge, so that you will be able to minimize the words that you use in order to make sure that he gets it, because being overly verbose is actually going to damage the information that this person will be able to intuit on his own. Now, it's in that context that we need to study a piece of Gemara, and the Rambam is going to explain to us how this Gemara relates to these three areas, these three visions that Yecheskel is having. Now, it would seem logical that it's a much easier concept to grasp, to understand the vision of Ofanim, than it is to understand the vision of Chayot. It's also probably easier to grasp a vision of Chayot, which is the celestial realm, than it is to grasp an image of what is beyond the celestial realm, which is at the very end of the first chapter of Ezekiel, the Chashmal and the Kisei and the Adam and all of the visionary depictions that are contained therein that are extremely cryptic in the last 2 or 3 verses of the first chapter of Ezekiel. And it's on that basis that we're going to be able to appreciate what the following Gemara has to say. Rav Yosef hava gamir ma'aseh hamerkavah. The Gemara tells us that a story about Rav Yosef, one of the Amoraim, he used to study ma'aseh Merkavah, and Sabeidu Pumpadisa havutanu b'ma'aseh bereshit. The elders of Pumpadisa did not engage in as esoteric of a study, but rather they only engaged in studying Maaseh Bereshit, which according to the Rambam means physics, whereas Rav Yosef engaged in the even more esoteric study of metaphysics. And I'll just paraphrase the first part of the Gemara. They basically asked Rav Yosef, please, kind sir, teach us your knowledge of Maaseh Merkavah. And Rav Yosef responded to them, you first teach me what you know of Maaseh Bereshit. And they taught him. And then they said, after they taught him, they said, now it's your turn, Rav Yosef. You teach us Maaseh Merkavah. And he said, I'm sorry. I'm not able to do that. And he produces various psukim, various verses from Tanakh to indicate that this is such esoteric knowledge that it has to remain underneath my tongue, and I'm not able to share it with you. So then the Gemara says, Amru le. They said to Rav Yosef, but Rav Yosef, you have to understand, we're not total ignoramuses that you should feel that you can't teach us. Taninan behu ad vayomer Eli ben Adam. That we already studied Maaseh Bereshit. And we studied the entire first chapter through the very end of chapter 1, which, as we'll see in a moment, contains those verses of Yecheskel's vision, that third vision of the most esoteric nature of looking at that which is directly closest to the divinity. So Amar Lahu, so he said back to them, Hein Maaseh HaMerkavah. Well, if that's the case, then you don't need me. You've studied all you need to know about the Merkavah because you've been able to grasp the most esoteric aspects of that visionary depiction of Yecheskel. And like Rashi says, he says, he says, because that's the part of the Yecheskel's vision that our rabbis did not want us to share with students. Because that part of the chapter deals with God's, I should say, the Shekhinah, the divine presence's image. And that's something that is so esoteric and is so given to misinterpretation. That's the part that the sages didn't want us to teach. And if you've already studied that, then what do you need me for? That's the end of the story between Rav Yosef and the rabbis of Pumpadisa. But the Gemara then challenges this, and it says, Meitive ad heichan ma'aseh hamerkavah. What is considered the act of the chariot about which the Mishnah says you're not supposed to teach it to even one disciple unless he's wise and discerning? So the girsa of the Rambam is Rebbe Meir, even though what we have in front of us is Rebbe. But it makes more sense for reasons that will be clear in a moment, that it's Rebbe Meir. Rebbe Meir Omer ad va'era batra, until the final va'era, until the final vision in verse 27 of the first chapter of Ezekiel, which, as we said, describes the most esoteric and sublime vision of the chashmal of the divinity. Rabbi Yitzchak Omer ad ha-chashmal, and Rabbi Yitzchak really just changes that very, very slightly. he doesn't disagree so much with Rebbe Meir, but he says instead of learning up until verse 27, you can actually go and read Va'era ke'ein chashmal of verse 27, but through those three words, and then you have to stop unless you have a discerning student. And then finally, so ad va'era megamrinan, mikan va'elach masrinan rashi prakim. From that point onwards, you can only give over rashi prakim. You can only give over the chapter headings, or it's sort of like just the basic, most general ideas. And ika da'amri, there are those who say ad va'ere masrinan rashi prakim. That no, the entire whole chapter of the chayot and of the ofanim must be given over in the most general of terms, generic of terms without getting into any specifics. Mikan va'elach imhu chacham mevin mida'ato in ilo lo. And from that point onwards, from verse 27 and on, the vision of the Shekhinah, if the person is a wise and discerning student, you may teach him, but if not, you may not teach him. Now, that's not exactly the way that we would have thought to infer from the Mishnah, because the Mishnah does not make any distinction between the first part of the Maaseh Merkavah and the latter part of Maaseh Merkavah. It does not make any distinction between which part of the vision Yecheskel is having. It simply states categorically that unless you have a student who is wise and discerning, you may not give him any information. And the Rambam understands that according to the Mishnah, you may only teach Rashi Prakim, the general, most generic of ideas, to a student who is wise and discerning on his own. And that, he says, is a reference to the entire first chapter of Ezekiel without making any distinctions between the vision of the Chayot, the vision of the Ofanim, or the vision of the divinity itself. Now, the question, therefore, is, how do we reconcile this Gemara with what the Mishnah says? According to the Rambam, and this is the point of this chapter, he tells us that it's actually a machloket. It's a machloket between the Mishnah, which was authored by Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, or Rabbeinu HaKadosh, Rabbi Judah the Prince, and the sages of this Braita, of this Talmudic teaching, are not agreeing with each other. So therefore, according to the Rambam, there are three opinions in the sages. And we're going to put Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yitzchak together because their disagreement is extremely slight as a matter of three words from the first part of verse 27. The first opinion is Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yitzchak in the first version of the Gemara, that they hold that the first two visions, that is the vision of the Chayot, the vision of the Ofanim, may be taught to anyone outright, as they are not formally Maaseh Merkavah, but rather Maaseh Bereshit. And that's what we started our discussion with today, is that included within Yecheskel's vision of Maaseh Merkavah is a discussion of physics, of the formation of the elements through the celestial bodies. The last vision is the part that the rabbis wanted to restrict, and that may only be taught to someone who is wise and discerning by giving them over Rashi Prakim, only the most generic and general of ideas. That's the first opinion in the Gemara. The second opinion in the Gemara is that Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yitzchak hold that the first two visions may only be taught as Rashi Prakim. You may only give over the most general ideas of the first two visions of the Chayot and the Ofanim, that is the celestial bodies and the elemental formation. And the last vision may not be taught at all. One who is wise and discerning will need to figure it out on his own. And that's what the Gemara means. You can only give Rashi Prakim to the up until verse 27. Mikan va'elachim hu chacham mevin midaito in ilolo. If he understands it on his own, great. If he doesn't understand it, then you can't give him anything. And then you have the opinion of our Mishnah, which is Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, and he maintains, and that's the opinion of the Mishnah, and this is codified by the Rambam, that the entire chapter counts as Maaseh Merkavah, even those parts that describe how the celestial bodies influence the elements, and we may only transmit Rashi Prakim to wise and discerning students throughout the chapter. And it's sort of a chumrah and a kula. It's a chumrah for the first two visions, but it's a kula, it's a leniency for the last vision, that according to the Mishnah, you are allowed to teach even the last two verses of Maaseh Merkavah to a student who is wise and discerning, only giving him Rashi Prakim. There is no distinction between the visions in this regard. So the first thing that the Rambam has accomplished in this chapter is to break down the first chapter of Ezekiel into three separate visions. And it's on that basis, he says, we can understand now the machloket, the dispute that exists in the Gemara, what portions of the first chapter of Ezekiel are forbidden to transmit, and what are the limitations of transmission. And all of this is a machloket. The sages of the Gemara in Tractate Chagiga, page 13a, actually end up disagreeing with the Mishnah, and we go with the opinion of the Mishnah that there is no distinction as far as what is permissible to transmit to a wise and discerning student. You can only give him Rashi Prakim. But the point of this exercise is to really explain to us that granted that the Mishnah doesn't make any distinction as to the permissibility of transmission, but it's important for us to know that there are three different realms of vision that Yechezkel is having. The last thing that the Rambam discusses in this chapter is the order of the three visions, which is equally important. If you were trying to discuss a hierarchical system, you could either start at the very top of the chain or you could start at the bottom of the chain. But what Yechezkel does is he starts in the middle. You could, in other words, if I was going to try to organize the way a prophet would have a vision, I would have either started at the bottom with the Ofanim and then go up to the Chayot, and from the Chayot go up to the divine realm, or start from the highest point, from the divine realm, which is the source of all emanation, down to the Chayot, the celestial bodies, and down to the Ofanim, to the elements. Why then does Yechezkel start with the Chayot, then go to the Ofanim, and then go back up above the Chayot and go to the divine realm? It doesn't seem to make any sense. There's no organization to it. So the Rambam gives us his explanation. He says the Chayot come first because of their nobility and of their causality, meaning that the Chayot are more important than the Ofanim. And also they give rise to the Ofanim. It is the celestial bodies that give rise to the elements. And therefore, any kind of vision that Yechezkel is going to have is necessarily going to place the Chayot before the Ofanim. And because of other things too, which the Rambam, it's very cryptic what he means when he says, and because of other things too. The Shem Tov explains that other things refers to the differing disciplines. The Ofanim are the study of physics, whereas astronomy requires the study of mathematics, a greater level of abstraction. And therefore, when you're teaching a student various different disciplines of knowledge, you start with math, and from math you go from the abstract, you go to the more specific, to the physics realm. And that's another reason why, because we can only understand astronomy through a knowledge of mathematics, because we can't actually study it up close, we can only study it from a distance, it was necessary from a sort of a pedagogical point of view for him to have a vision of the Chayot before a vision of the Ofanim. So he actually gives really three reasons, according to the commentaries, as to why the Chayot had to precede the Ofanim. Number one, they're higher in holiness and nobility. Number two, they're the cause of the Ofanim. And number three, they represent a discipline of knowledge that necessarily must precede a discussion of physics. Then he says, why did we follow with the Ofanim? Because they're controlled by the Chayot. Why then didn't we start with the most sublime realm first? He says that comes last. The divine realm of that vision of the man comes last because, and we quote here, the first two apprehensions necessarily precede the third apprehension in the order of knowledge, the latter being inferred with the help of the other two. And what the Rambam seems to be explaining is that no one can actually have direct knowledge of the divine realm. We only understand God as a product of studying the world that he gave us, the world that he created for us. And therefore, Yechezkel can only infer a knowledge of God after he first studies the Chayot and the Ofanim. And this is exactly what the project of Moreh Nevukhim is all about. It's beautiful that the Rambam is sort of presenting this idea to us using the text of Ezekiel. He's basically saying you can actually see from the biblical text that if you wish to understand Hashem, you have to first study the Chayot and the Ofanim. you have to study metaphysics, you have to study physics, and from there you can infer a knowledge of God. There's no way to actually understand God or have any access to him or have any dveikut with him unless you first gain this necessary kind of knowledge. We're rapidly running out of time, so I'd like to quickly do chapter 6. It's a very short chapter, but contains just a really important point, and that is that the Rambam says something quite fascinating. He says Yecheskel is not the only prophet that had a vision of the chariot. And this has ramifications to our prayers that we say, you and I say every single day. If we take a look at chapter 6 of the book of Isaiah, according to Rashi, chapter 6 of Isaiah is the very first visionary prophecy that Isaiah has. Even though he has visions prior in the first 5 chapters of Isaiah, Rashi says the famous principle of Ein Mukdam u'Meuchar b'Torah. There is no chronological order in Scripture. But beyond that, if you understand the vision of chapter 6 in this way, that it's the first vision that Yechezkel has, it is also the most esoteric vision, because he says he sees God sitting on a lofty throne, and the hems of his garment are filling the palace. And it says, Seraphim omdim ma'alo. There are angelic seraphim who are standing all around God, each one having 6 wings, and describing how these angelic beings use their 6 wings to cover their face, their legs, with which they fly. And then, of course, the famous verse which contains the Latin term, the trisagion, the tripled proclamation of holy. V'kara ze el ze v'amar, kadosh, 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 Hashem tzivakot, meloch al haaretz kivodo. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The entire universe or the entire world is filled with his glory. The Talmud tells us something fascinating. And it tells us that there's a contrast between the prophet Isaiah and the prophet Ezekiel. And it's this point that the Rambam is picking up on. And he tells us that, quite interestingly, the vision that took Yechezkel an entire chapter, these 28 verses to portray, with all of the imagery of the chayot and the ofanim and the kisei and the chashmal and all of these really, really esoteric and quite startling visions and vivid, really, really vivid visionary depictions, all of that is what Isaiah saw as well, but he left out the vast majority of that vision and just described the angels calling out, holy, 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 kadosh, kadosh, kadosh. He says Isaiah's vision is no different from the vision of Maaseh Merkavah. It turns out, actually, that whenever you and I pray Birkot Kriyat Shema, and we say Kiddusham, we say Kadosh, 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 we're actually mimicking the visionary experience of Isaiah, which, according to the Rambam, is no different from the visionary experience of Ezekiel chapter 1, the Maaseh Merkavah. We therefore certainly have no idea what we're really depicting in our minds, but we're just saying this is what the angels proclaim. The question, of course, is why isn't Isaiah's vision as filled with the vividness of Ezekiel's vision? So the Rambam quotes the Talmud, which states, again in Tractate Chagiga, this time page 13b, Omar Rava, Kol Shera'a Yechezkel, Ra'a Yeshaya. Anything that Yechezkel saw was seen by Isaiah as well. Lama Yechezkel domeh. What is Yechezkel, and to whom is Yechezkel analogous? Leven kfar shera'at hamelech. He's like a villager who sees the king for the first time. Ulama Yeshaya domeh. Leven krach shera'at hamelech. He resembles a city dweller who sees the king. Now, who has a greater understanding of the king and the workings of his entourage? Obviously, the person who lives in the capital city has probably seen the king in his entourage parading around the city many times. The villager may be only witnessing the king for the very first time, and it's a source of fascination for him. And it's on that basis, the Rambam writes, because the city person knew that other city people already know the makeup of the king's chariots, the king's chariot and entourage, He did not bother to describe it, but rather only said, I saw the ruler. I saw an image of God. He doesn't have to describe the chayot and the ofanim, the entire, pomp and circumstance of the king, because everyone who lives in the city already has it in their mind, because whenever they've seen the king in all of his majesty, they already know what that vision represents. The villager, however, wishing to describe this to his fellow villagers, detailed the entire makeup of the king's chariot procession, his armies, ministers, and those who carry out his orders. So that's the reason why Isaiah does not go into detail, because he's speaking to an audience and he himself understands that I don't need to describe all of the vividness that was described by Ezekiel. Now I want to hearken us back to what the Rambam had said when he talked about the whole idea of presenting excessive verbiage and metaphor to a person who is discerning on his own, and which is why you only give him over Rashi Prakim. It turns out that, like we learned in the previous chapter, that when someone is truly wise, using added verbiage is a detraction, is actually diminishing the ability for the person to appreciate intellectually a sublime intellectual experience or concept. And so in some way, what the Rambam is trying to convey using this Talmudic quote is that Isaiah was on a higher level because he did not need to use all of the metaphorical imagery that Ezekiel needed to muster in order to get across his vision. And the Rambam actually tells us that there are two possible explanations. When we say that Isaiah is superior to Yechezkel, it could mean one of two things. Either Isaiah's generation did not require all the detail that was necessary for Ezekiel's generation, because Ezekiel's generation were already living in exile in Babylon. And therefore, they're like the generation itself, not Ezekiel per se, but his generation and the world in which he's living is an inferior world, is a diaspora world, and therefore requires more vivid imagery, more explanation, more detail, because they don't have the ability to understand it and discern it on their own, because they've been living in the exile, they've been living in the diaspora. Isaiah is speaking to people before the destruction of the temple. He's conveying to the people of Eretz Yisrael who are used to experiencing divinity all around them, and therefore he can speak more tersely. The other explanation is actually a commentary not on the generation and the community, but rather a comment on the prophets themselves. That is, Isaiah was a superior prophet to Ezekiel. And if you recall, when the Rambam in section 2 talked about the different levels of prophecy, he did not include Ezekiel in examples of people who achieved sublime prophecy like Isaiah, because apparently the Rambam maintains that Ezekiel was on a lower level of prophecy. Ezekiel's vision was so startling to him personally because of his lower level of prophecy that he felt a need to describe it, whereas Isaiah, the superior prophet, was accustomed to seeing such spectacles, and thus felt no need to detail it. Two explanations. It seems from the commentaries, from the Shem Tov commentary, that the Rambam is subscribing to the latter in what he believes is the more correct interpretation, but out of respect to Ezekiel, not wishing to detract from his greatness, he offered the first possibility as well, that Ezekiel was merely a product of the people to whom he was communicating, the people of the diaspora. And the Rambam had, the Shem Tov tells us we need to go back to the Rambam's introduction to Moreh Nevukhim, where he had quoted us this midrash. Rabbanan Amrin al yehi hamashal hazeh kal be'einecha. Do not allow parables or proverbs to be light in your eyes, metaphors. Shal yedei hamashal hazeh adam yachol la'amod b'divrei Torah. It is only through parables that people are able to appreciate more esoteric ideas contained in the Torah. Mashal lemelech she'avad zahav mi beito umargiliyot tova. We can compare this to a king who lost some precious gold coins or some precious pearls. Lo al yedei pitila ki isar hu motzeota. He says, how does a king find the gold or the lost pearl? He lights a candle that costs virtually nothing. The candle is almost valueless, certainly by comparison to the gold and the pearls. But it is through the candle that has very little value that he's able to find something extremely valuable. And so too, says the Medrash, parables have a surface meaning that may not be conveying a significant amount of information. But through that metaphor of the parable, which is like the candle, you're able to uncover and unearth extremely precious information that is priceless as gold and pearls. That's what the Rambam had told us. He says prophetic images are parables of a certain truth that can be grasped with wisdom without the parable. The parable facilitates the understanding of the hidden wisdom within the vision. In the same vein, Isaiah was capable of grasping the esoteric realm without all the added images, whereas Ezekiel needed the added imagery in order to capture the full meaning of the esoteric prophecy. And again, it harkens back to the whole idea of Rashi Prakim that the Rambam was talking about in his Mishnah commentary. The wiser the individual, the more he's capable of understanding concepts without mishalim, without parables. And sometimes to the point where the parable actually, so to speak, dumbs down the esoteric message. So we're much better off taking, if we can appreciate all the sublime information contained within a terse prophecy like Isaiah's, we are better off if we can appreciate what Isaiah is communicating than if we must rely only on an Ezekiel-like prophecy in order to gain that esoteric knowledge. And that's the point that the Rambam wants to make in comparing Isaiah to Ezekiel, again, utilizing Torah Sheba'al Peh, the Gemara in Chagiga, to be able to help us appreciate this visionary experience, but also to point out to us that we should not be overly fascinated by the image of the chariot and recognize that an even more sublime level of appreciating the esoteric vision is to look towards a minimization of text in order to be able to appreciate the most sublime of ideas, which transcend knowledge and transcend parable. This is where we'll hold it for today, my friends. I hope that you were able to gain something out of it. We've gone way over time. Thanks for sticking around, and we'll see you, Be'ezrat Hashem, next time. Take care, everyone.
Thank